part 3 of the Secrets of Supper. This is my favorite part, the most fun. It's food I call this you are what you eat, because for most of us, what we eat has become our identity. And that's the cause of food fights and culture wars. So if I say Beantown, you know what place I'm talking about, Boston, right? And if I say cheeseheads, I'm not talking about Arizona. I'm talking about Wisconsin, producer of cheese. 2 years ago, which city filed papers to officially become known as Taco Town?
Ooh.
Los Angeles.
Oh.
Maine actually went to the Supreme Court to protect the words Maine lobster from being used by New Hampshire fishermen and dealers who were claiming the right to sell theirs as Maine lobster because they fished it in the Gulf of Maine. And Maine was having nothing to do with that, and they had the Supreme Court of the United States tell New Hampshire, you're not Maine. So we have defended our identity. And during the roll call of the 2020 Democratic Convention, does anybody remember who introduced themselves as the calamari comeback state? Rhode Island. When they said Rhode Island, they said we're the calamari comeback state. All of which is just to say food turns out to be identity. Think about all the barbecue. Do you notice it's not enough to just be barbecue when you go out to eat? Right here in Portland, it's St. Louis ribs at Salvation, Texas barbecue at Terlingua on Washington Ave, but it's North Carolina barbecue at Wilsons County down on Hanover Street in Bayside. And we used to have Beals here, which was Tennessee barbecue, and none of that is Tex-Mex. So look at it this way. If I say deli, you're likely to think Jewish, not Chinese, right?
Right.
If I say curry, who do you think of? If I say
Indeed.
pizza, are you probably thinking Italians? But you better think again on that one, because there is now a 1960s and 70s New York City neon restaurant sign in the Smithsonian collection that says Goldberg's Pizzeria.
Oh.
And we have soul food, which is intimately tied to soul music, which comes from the American Black community and identifies them. An increasingly popular part of that soul food is what's called Nashville hot chicken. This is not buffalo wings, and it has now been usurped by white Nashville entrepreneurs, which is causing a bit of a rough down in Nashville. We also eat sandwiches, don't we, called Cubanos? And here in Maine, that long roll that's filled with salami, bologna, and cheese. Elsewhere, you order it up as a hoagie, a sub, or a hero. But only in Maine, it is called an Italian, because the locals perceived it was coming from the kitchen of an Italian immigrant. And indeed, that was its origin. The story is that a Down East fisherman's wife packed him just such a lunch, that sandwich, and his envious friends asked for one of those Italian sandwiches too, and they've been known in Maine at the general stores as Italians ever since. You and I eat English muffins and Brussels sprouts and Greek salad and French fries. We eat Canadian bacon to differentiate those round slabs of pork from the more prevalent strips that we call bacon. That name, Canadian, came from England in the mid-1800s when there was a pork shortage and the pork had to be imported from Canada. And so they brought it over and the British called it Canadian bacon. We say Philly cheesesteak, Georgia peach, and now we say Idaho potatoes, which only came into existence when the Maine potato rotted away. But we still call our potatoes Kennebec and Katahdin. And for years on menus, the words Kennebec salmon meant a luxury special from the state of Maine, and now it's coming from the Pacific. Famous New Orleans cooking is either Cajun or Creole. Cajun means dishes from the Acadians who fled down there from here after the War of 1812. But Creole means influenced by slaves who were brought up from the Caribbean. Shrimp étouffée is obviously Cajun because of the French word. Étouffée is French for smothered or suffocated. In relation to food, it's the method of cooking where seafood is just smothered or buried in vegetables with a sauce. But do notice the dish is shrimp étouffée, not crevette étouffée. So they're French people in English-speaking America. About 8 years ago, at the height of the massive Syrian emigration due to the civil war, the most famous chefs of London came together with a plan to raise money for the refugees who had reached their city. It was called Cook for Syria, and the plan was to bring the Syrian people to the public's attention by putting distinctly Syrian food on the menu for one weekend and giving all the income from those dishes to the refugees. The idea that gave birth to this plan was that to let Londoners literally taste Syria and keep its ancient culture alive by cooking its food would keep Syria alive. And just recently in Portland, Palestinians did that with Palestinian food, because your food can represent your people, your culture. Every year we experience food just this way as a stand-in for the people who eat it and cook it. There's that traditional Irish meal we all eat in the pubs of Portland on St. Patrick's Day, corned beef, potatoes, and cabbage. In August, St. Peter's, every summer you go to the Italian festival in front of the Catholic Church, and that is what? It's all about Italian food, essentially Southern Italian food, because that's where most of the original immigrants to Portland who went to that church came here from. And then you can go to Portland's annual Greek festival at the Greek Orthodox Church, and you will not get Italian food. You will stuff yourself on feta cheese and stuffed grape leaves and dishes that are distinctly Greek, not Irish or Italian. And you do not get Indian chat snacks at the Jewish Film Festival. And if you don't think keeping your culinary identity is a really big deal, you have not been reading your newspaper. Koreans are fighting angry because the Chinese are trying to muscle in on making kimchi. In 2022, India and Pakistan went to the European court to fight out their dispute over which country can legally market basmati rice, the one you have in your pantry, as theirs. Pakistan's government has vowed to vehemently oppose the Indian application for basmati rice to be recognized by the EU as exclusively India. Since 2006, the EU has applied 0 tariffs on this imported rice if it was authenticated by either Pakistan or Indian authorities as genuine. But about 2/3 of basmati imports are from India, and the rest is from Pakistan, and India doesn't like them having credit. The application by the Indian government for sole geographic indication, GI status, for its homegrown rice has prompted alarm at the highest levels of Pakistani government. The Indian application says the special characteristics of basmati is grown and produced in all districts of the state of Punjab, Haryana, Delhi, Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, and specific districts of Western Uttar Pradesh and Jammu and Kashmir. And GI status is used to signify to you, the consumer, that a product has qualities, reputation, or characteristics relating to its actual place of origin. In Europe, products such as Parma ham, Parmesan cheese, Champagne, and Stilton cheese have this status, allowing producers from these prospective regions to charge you higher prices and, of course, prevent anyone else from using their name. This gives the exclusive right to put their name on the packet. The French Post Office last year released a scratch and sniff postage stamp to celebrate the baguette, once described by President Macron as, quote, 250 grams of magic and perfection. The stamp, which cost 1.96 euros, depicts a baguette, you can see it, decorated with a red, white, and blue ribbon. There was a run of 594,000 copies. And according to the Parisian shop Le Carré d'Encre, which sells that stamp, it has a bakery scent on it. The ink used contains microcapsules which provide the fragrance of the baking bread. This baguette, the bread of our daily lives, the symbol of our gastronomy, the jewel of our culture, the post office says on its website. Several years ago, the European Postal Union asked every member country to submit another stamp design to identify its culture through its cooking. And in Greece, there was a huge fight over whether that stamp should be the familiar moussaka or the very unique and local taro roasted pork, which you can only find on the Greek island of Crete. Italy and Croatia are now battling over the similarity of the words Prosecco and Prosec. In fact, Italy has gone overboard to protect that word Prosecco as belonging only to a certain region of the country. Over the decades, Italy has given different protected geographical indications for different bottles of Prosecco, depending on where they were produced. The traditional hills, the original spot, get a brown seal, but 9 new provinces where the wine is being made now have a blue one. And those old hills get an extra GI for guaranteed origin. The new ones don't have that. But it is said most consumers like you and me wouldn't know the difference. We're just looking for the name Prosecco, and that is why they're trying to stop Croatians from selling Prosec. They are also fighting the Italians and the Croatians over balsamic vinegar, who invented it and who can claim it. This is exactly why the French went to court to stop the state of California from calling its sparkling wine champagne. Champagne is the region of France where the drink comes from. Its identity is French. And the Californians were told to cease and desist using the word. And so now, if you look at a bottle of bubbly from California, it will say sparkling wine, method champagnoise, using those French words as hint, hint, but they can't be stopped. More recently, Tunisia has asked the United Nations to protect its beloved condiment harissa from all the other hot copies. And in 2017, back to Italy, a country whose identity is probably more intertwined in our hearts with good eating than any other one, fought to get the art of the Neapolitan pizza maker added to UNESCO's list of the world's intangible heritage. And then in January 2022, Italy went back and asked UNESCO to protect another signifier of Italian identity, espresso, claiming, quote, "It is much more than a simple drink. Espresso is an authentic ritual and an expression of our sociality that distinguishes Italians around the world," said Gianmarco Certinaio, the agricultural undersecretary, who confirmed that the application had been submitted. Espresso quickly became an integral part of the national identity after its creation in Torino at the end of the 19th century. Drinking espresso for Italians creates an occasion to encounter, to discuss politics and football, to complain, to make peace with your friends or family, to pay a debt, or it's simply an excuse to get out of the house and talk. According to the Italian Espresso Institute, which was founded in 1998, specifically to safeguard and promote the original meaning of espresso, the market for espresso, get this, is worth 4 billion euros annually, with more than 90% of Italians drinking a cup of it every day, usually in that little porcelain cup. And the Institute's strict regulations for the perfect espresso mean you have to use a certified coffee blend, certified equipment, and even licensed personnel. Otherwise, it's not real espresso. And that may be why here you sometimes see it with an X. It specifies, the Italian one, that the crema, the lighter froth on top of the dark brew, must be uniform and persistent for at least 120 seconds, from the time the coffee has been dispensed. It says the color has to be hazel brown to dark brown and characterized by tawny reflexes, or it's a cheat. Haiti has jumu soup, and it is called, quote, our culture in a bowl. And now that has UNESCO protected status too, just like any landmark. This dish, which was originally cooked by slaves for their owners, has come to symbolize hope and dignity in this troubled Caribbean country that was actually the world's first Black-led republic. The soup, which is made from the turban squash, is Haiti's first inclusion on the UNESCO protected list, and the country's UNESCO ambassador, Dominique Dupuy, cried as the announcement was made. Since Haiti's independence in 1804, jumu soup has become the national symbol of its liberation from slavery, and it is eaten on January 1, which is the country's Independence Day, as a reminder of that. Foods are such a marker of cultural identity. They are such a source of pride that after much prodding, the United Nations Art Agency, UNESCO, which is in charge of, protecting historic landmarks, has now protected certain dishes or ways of cooking as world treasures, right up there with the Taj Mahal, the Giza Pyramid, and Chartres Cathedral, Historic Quebec, and the Magna Carta, just so you know they really mean it. This recognizes cooking as an equally valuable part of our human heritage. And here is a short list of some of the cultural heritage foods as of 2022. And you can see in an instance how certain nationalities aren't letting their neighbors get the credit. Ukraine borscht cooking, French baguette, al-mansif, a banquet of Jordan, tea processing in China, Tunisian harissa, Haitian jumu, Armenian lavash, the Mediterranean diet, which is allowed to go to Spain, Italy, Portugal, and Greece, not France, Turkish coffee, Mexican cooking, flatbreads, which are allowed to go to Iran, Azerbaijan, the scones, and Turkey, washoku, Japanese aesthetic food, Belgian beer, French cooking, hawker food culture in Singapore, couscous from Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. We vary winemaking in Georgia, which has been making wine for 8,000 years and is thought to be the oldest winemaking in the world. Stuffed grape leaves, not from Greece, but from Azerbaijan, who lobbied harder because they have the grapes and the grape leaves. Neapolitan pizza, Nisima from Malawi, which is a cornmeal porridge, Il Tritra from Malta, which is a flattened sourdough bread, kimchi, and there's two separate citations for North and South Korea, and Croatian litars, which are the gingerbread craft bread from North Croatia, not South. We have plov from Uzbekistan, which is paella in Spain. And we have arag, also called kumis, which comes from Mongolia. And from Paraguay, we have terere. But there's more, but it isn't all glory. Then we have derogatory slang like krauts to describe which people. Germans, because they're so fond of sauerkraut. Who are frogs? French, because they eat frogs' legs. And limeys, who eat lime. The British, because their sailors took limes on long sea voyages to prevent scurvy. Americans have their own derogatory way to identify those back to the land, organic, free love 60s Zen hippies, tofu eaters. Near the end of the 19th century, Brahmin Bostonians began complaining about the huge influx of Southern Italian immigrants, saying that they made the city reek of garlic. And that reek seemed to be such an enormous threat to American identity that the Boston Cooking School, run by a panicked woman named Fanny Farmer, set out to protect our dinner table and our identity by teaching all those smelly, garlicky Italians, Irish, and pastrami-eating Jews how to eat like real Americans. What ultimately became known as the Fanny Farmer Cookbook, was the weapon in the first food war for e pluribus unum, one diet out of too many. Farmer's creation of standard measurements and her insistence on level measurements assured nobody could vary what she was saying. And that American way of eating book is still selling over 130 years later. I bet almost everybody has it on their bookshelf. It is still one of the prime wedding gifts that young brides will get. And of course, this led to adoptions. Trying to Americanize the foreign food led to adoptions like spaghetti with meatballs, which is Italian-American and not Italian in any way at all. The Trojan horse in what became this food war that Fanny Farmer launched was school lunches. You may be interested to know that the school lunch was deliberately instituted at this time of mass immigration to Boston and New York to stop immigrant children from bringing their weird family food to the classroom table. And it was already understood that children do not want to be different from their peers. They want to belong to the crowd and not be bullied or ostracized from it. So schools began providing standard American lunches to make all children feel truly American. And as they expected, those children went home and told their parents, I'm only going to eat real American food, not what you're cooking. And that forced their parents to adapt to the American diet and Fanny Farmer's cookbook. Ergo, spaghetti with meatballs and cinnamon raisin bagels. By the 1950s, you may remember, all of us were eating about 5 vegetables, hamburgers and hot dogs, symbols of our Independence Day, fried chicken in some form, jarred applesauce with Oreos. Remember, the very first food franchise was Howard Johnson's, and it came right here out of New England. And it was all about our red hot dogs and our New England clam chowder and our love of ice cream. And then the next franchises came from the West Coast where they were had a lot of cattle. So it was all about hamburgers. And then came the 1960s. And this was not just a moment of political protests and civil disobedience, but a new time of airplane travel and newly affluent college grads going on the formerly aristocratic only tour of Europe. And there they found, voila, different food. And suddenly on the new educational television, there she was, Julia Child, promoting French cooking. And Americans literally ate it up. Betty Crocker now had competition. Americans were now discovering that all Italians were not just Southern red sauce, but they were coming here from the north, the land of risotto and pesto. The Spanish were tapas and paellas, and the Japanese very exotic with those hibachis and sushi. By the 1980s, our unified cultural identity with what we ate was ripping apart, starting new class education casts based on what did you eat, tater tots or arugula? Did you have hamburger helper on your shelf or Grey Poupon? Real Americans eat beef. Real Americans celebrate our land sustenance with those all-you-can-eat buffets, not like the tiny exquisite portions of the Japanese, because Japan has never had enough food to go around, and this is how they compensated for it. And so we have this food fight. What is an American to eat? And that is still in high gear today, called the culture wars. If you don't believe me, I have this October 27th, 2020 article that was in the middle of the election 2020 from the New York Times. And it was during the Biden-Trump election. And it said, can you tell a Trump fridge from a Biden fridge? A MAGA hat, that's easy. A Trump supporter. A Biden-Harris tote in the kitchen is an obvious giveaway. But if you have coffee mate or a bunch of eggs not in the crate, we wondered, the sociologist said, if it was possible to identify Trump and Biden voters based on what was in their refrigerator. On the theory, it could say something about our similarities and assumptions about one another. So they teamed up with Lucid an online survey platform, to ask a representative sample of US residents who are you planning to vote for? And then would you open your fridge and take a picture of the contents? And hundreds of people did. So here's two pictures that the New York Times put up, and see if you can tell who voted for who, just by the fridge. So food can tell a lot about your identity, even your political beliefs. So our attempts to sew up this big rip in our nation's food identity most lately has involved an emphasis no longer on a kind of national American diet, but what we're now calling regional cooking. We're getting more specific about our identity. Southwest meals are not New England meals, and California cuisine isn't Southern fried. And we've also seen the adoption of food from south of the border, Tex-Mex and just plain Mex. Salsa is now more popular than ketchup, and tacos rival hot dogs. So what can you do? You can go right now into Hannaford's or Shaw's and take home all of this food for dinner, Taco Tuesday if you want, and possibly because we have absorbed so many citizens from south of the border, we still feel that if we're having a Taco Tuesday, that's an American diet. But here's a twist on that. In the summer of 2020, before the presidential election, there were huge headlines about a Goya food boycott. Here is why. When Linnea Baez Rosario moved to the United States as a young girl, she missed her home in the Dominican Republic. So her parents made sure to cook with the familiar flavors to keep her memories of her identity alive. As an adult, the 42-year-old special education kindergarten teacher in New York City found those same tastes in the supermarket in Goya foods. Goya is the one product, she said, I know that my family used, that my mom still uses, because it's the one that resembles home to us. However, in July 2020, in the heat of the election politicking, Lisa decided she would no longer buy Goya products again. Why? Because during a visit to the White House, the company's president, Robert Unanue, loudly praised President Trump. He actually compared Trump to his grandfather, an immigrant from Spain who founded Goya Food in 1936. We're all truly blessed at the same time, he said, to have a leader like President Trump. Immediately after learning of Mr. Unanue's comments, Latino consumers began dumping pantry cans and bottles and calling for a boycott on social media with the hashtag boycott Goya, give away Goya. And then Mr. Unanue apologized and people went back to buying Goya. As this story also tells us, our food identity gets bred into us from our birth. From our earliest days, our relationships influence how and what we eat. Our palates are shaped first and foremost by our families of origin, and the first 5 years of life are, quote, when eating behaviors that will serve as the foundation for future eating develops. That was according to a 2007 report in the Journal of Law, Medicine, and Ethics. It said during these early years, children learn what, when, and how to eat based on the transmission of cultural and family beliefs, attitudes, and practices surrounding food. This seems to be the reason, for example, why the very elderly people who will lose their appetites and sometimes their minds will readily dig in if you serve them a childhood dish. It cuts through everything and comes back. I did that once at a senior center in Portland and it worked. What parents feed their kids seems to shape their favorite foods and how they are open to new flavors. And this study revealed that children are predisposed originally to be omnivorous. They found that the flavors infants are introduced to, even in utero, can influence their diet later in life. Children introduced to complex flavors and spices early on will grow up with an adventurous palate and readily embrace new flavors. But when we grow up and then we forge new personal relationships, we may also be introduced to new foods which we come to love, or which we come to hate, and that could ruin the relationship. Whether we realize it or not, our kinship rituals involve food. We bond newcomers to our family. We allow them to share our identity by feeding them. Doesn't just about every couple that wants to get married go to meet the parents? Where? Over dinner. You remember that 1970s film, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? With Katharine Hepburn, Spencer Tracy, and Sidney Poitier. But that dinner is just the beginning. Then there is the wedding banquet, where table seating is a ritualized way that shows who's identified with who. And we seal the bond between husband and wife and their respective families, acknowledging a new identity in this union when the bride and groom feed each other bread at the beginning and cake at the end. There are distinct feeding ceremonies in Hindu, Moroccan, and Korean weddings to do the same thing. Nepali people have a newborn tradition called first rice. They do not celebrate the immediate arrival of a baby. They wait 5 to 6 months for that moment when the baby is ready to be weaned from mother's milk and served its first food. This will be rice boiled down to a porridge. All the relatives on both sides of that family will be present, and each one feeds the baby a speck of rice. This giving of food identifies the baby as having an official place in the family and identifies to the baby who the members of its family are. Food is actually such an integral part of a family culture that dietary preferences and restrictions, as you may know, can create cracks in relationships. If mealtime customs are broken or disregarded, there can be strife. Conflict seems particularly likely when someone we're close to changes our diet, or our other partner's family serves food we don't like. And we're coming right up on the biggest day for these food fights, Thanksgiving, because it is so traditional and everybody's family has traditions that you cannot break. And many people over the years have told me it's a real battle over whose grandmother's stuffing or green bean casserole is going to make it to the table and whose mother's apple pie or cranberry sauce. It's like an assault on our genes and our memories, our sense of who we are, if we can't identify with the dishes on the table at this very accustomed and habitual celebration. I actually once had a contretemps with an Irish American who insisted there had to be mashed potatoes served on Thanksgiving, when mashed potatoes had never been served at my family's Thanksgiving, and I didn't want them on the table, but he made them and put them out, and I shut my mouth. Recipes are always part of a family heritage, part of your identity, and they get passed down from grandmothers and mothers to their daughters, sometimes to their sons. I know people who've invested time and money tracing lost family recipes and making booklets to pass them on so they stay part of your identity. And then, we all heard this, there are mothers who show a subtle dislike for their new daughters-in-law by not giving them heirloom recipes, or worse, deliberately falsifying them so the new family member cannot really take on the mother-in-law's identity. Star always nods at that part. Well, they say you can't take it with you, so many family recipes do disappear when loved ones die. But family members have now found a way to keep their identity alive forever. In cemeteries from Alaska to Israel, families are memorializing their loved ones with the deceased most cherished recipes carved in their headstone. These dishes, mostly desserts, give relatives a way to remember the sweet times and perhaps bring joy to visitors who discover them among the more traditional headstones. Martha Catherine Kirkham Andrews and her husband, Wade Anderson, read a book about funny epitaphs and decided to make their tombstones a reflection of their lives. Martha's husband chose to commemorate his life on his side of the tombstone with several images, including the B-24 Liberator bomber he flew in World War II. It was named Salt Lake Katy after his wife. Martha, however, picked the fudge recipe she often took to church functions, club meetings, and other get-togethers. The recipe drew so many onlookers at the Logan City Cemetery in Utah that the area containing her plot became known as the fudge section of the cemetery, and tourists are now showing up to see it. And finally, closer to home, after the Civil War, community cookbooks were created to raise funds for the veterans. Today, they are gathered at the Schlesinger Library of Radcliffe College, and they are used as sociological documents because they will reveal the identity of the community that put it together. One that might be of interest to us is from 1877, and it is called Fish, Flesh, and Fowl. And it was issued by the ladies of the State Street Church in Portland. Along with quotes from Milton and Shakespeare, it has 64 pages of recipes, including ones for bannock, Banbury tarts, and potted shad. A second edition got enlarged to 112 recipes in 1894, and now they had recipes for frozen treats like ice cream and crab with canned crab meat, indicating these ladies were of considerable means because they could have the newest fangled instruments. But not to be outdone, the ladies of the Second Parish Church, the Payson Memorial Congregation Church, which was at the corner of Pearl and Congress, issued their own identifying cookbook in 1886 and a bigger one in 1893. Their recipes are rich in ingredients and cost, even poverty pudding. All their recipes call for creaming, buttering, wrapping in suet, frittering, which means frying, and sugaring, which tells you nobody was diet conscious in that congregation. Toward the end of the 19th century, with the damages of the Great Fire of 1866 a fading memory, the Portland you and I know began to take shape. The Woodman Building, the Thomas Block, Mechanics Hall, and other landmarks stood just a heartbeat away from the great new fortune flaunting mansions at the west end of families with names like Morse, Fletcher, and Spring. The new Customs House was ceremoniously opened April 1st, 1872, with a monumental spread of food laid out between a whole steamship round of beef and a ham large enough to flaunt this inscription: success and prosperity to Portland. Food was one way now for Portland to manifest its new world status. Forest City's well-heeled laid it on at dinner time with no reminders of Yankee thrift. Massive pork or beef roast surrounded by Welsh rarebit, omelets, creamed eggs on toast, escalloped seafood, many vegetables, all of them creamed, and then a grand display of desserts. Portly best describes the leading citizens. In fact, the prime advertisement for Portland's Renaissance was its most illustrious citizen, the 6'3", 300-pound Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, Portland Congressman Thomas Brackett Reed. As he made his way through town, someone is supposed to have cried very loudly, "My, how small he makes the street look." We say, maybe, I say, food is identity writ large. So Hannah, there's a project for you to collect community cookbooks like the Radcliffe Library and have a go at them.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Because sociologists have been using them as
I bet the history room has some.
and anthropologists have been using them as really good documents.
Yeah.
Do you have any questions? Anybody online with chat questions? No? Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was great.